After thorough questioning, Cortes found out that Montezuma, to whom the chieftain of Zempoala paid tribute, was an arrogant, domineering, and brutal ruler, both despised and feared by all his underlings, who were merely waiting for a chance to break free from his dominion. Cortes withheld his gratification about the information divulged to him. He understood the ease with which even the mightiest empires can crumble when tension and misunderstandings build between leadership and the populace. Now, he was certain about the success of his venture, which, without this handy turn of events, could have been remarkably reckless. The Native Americans were sent off with confident promises for them and their leader, and the assurance that Cortes would soon pay them a visit. Keeping his word and simultaneously exploring a suggested site for a settlement, he set off with his troops after directing his fleet to sail nearby. By sunset of the first day, they arrived at a deserted Native American settlement, the deserted homes and temples full of deity figures, remnants of human sacrifices, and some books, the earliest ones found in America, were left behind. These books were made from treated animal skins, coated with a sticky substance and organized in pages. Rather than words, they were filled with assorted illustrations and symbols associated with the withheld Mexican faith. The following day, Cortes carried on. They found themselves in vast, lush meadows and forested areas abundant with tropical vegetation. Majestic treetops were draped with deep crimson, elegant hanging plants and other vibrant parasitic shimmers of color. The underbrush was interwoven with thorny aloes, wild roses, and honeysuckles, forming dense, nearly impassable thickets in some spots. Amid this profusion of fragrant blooms, numerous birds and butterfly clouds fluttered, while melodious songbirds serenaded the surroundings. Even though the conquerors weren't particularly receptive to natural beauty, they couldn't suppress their delight. As they trekked through this terrestrial Eden, it likened to the exquisite landscapes of their homeland. Cortes was taken aback to discover the entire area empty, even though it was the territory of the chief of Zempoala. This seemed suspicious to him. However, by late afternoon, 12 locals, bearing supplies, who had been dispatched by the chief, encountered them. They implored the Spanish commander to visit their leader's dwelling, which was just a day's journey from their current location. The chief had everything Cortes and his crew required. When questioned why the chief himself hadn't personally greeted him, they stated his physical ailment was the reason. Cortes dispatched 6 of the locals back with gratitude, keeping the remainder as guides. The next day, they glimpsed the chief's city, situated in a verdant, vibrant area, with a very appealing view. Some of the vanguard soldiers sped back, animatedly proclaiming that the city walls were constructed of pure silver. To their colossal disappointment, they realized their error, as the walls were simply coated with a cement so bright and reflective in the daylight that it readily fooled those who incessantly fantasized about nothing but gold and silver. Upon entering the city, they saw all the roads and public parks brimming with intrigued locals who were unarmed and behaved more calmly than one might have predicted for such a large group of unrefined individuals. As they neared the home of the tribal chief, the chief himself made his presence known. His form presented the constraints which had hindered him from venturing out to greet his visitors. He was frighteningly obese to such an extent that he could barely move, requiring his attendants to aid and relocate him from place to place. His spacious physique and clumsy demeanor were comically exaggerated that Cortes faced a tough time preventing his men from bursting into laughter and maintaining his own composure. The tribal chief wore an impressively flashy outfit. His was garbed in a robe generously studded with gemstones, and his ears and lips were pierced and lushly decorated. His welcome speech was in total contrast to his ridiculous presence. It was quite astute and well composed, ending with an invitation for Cortes to be his honored guest and stay with him, opening a potential opportunity for them to chat leisurely. The remainder of the day was filled with relishing the refreshments and the plenty of fruits accessible in the surrounding vicinity. During his parley with the tribal leader, Cortes intentionally gave the impression that he'd been dispatched by the eminent Eastern ruler with the mission to eradicate tyranny in that region. This spurred the leader to voice severe criticisms of Montezuma's arrogance and unfairness, branding him without hesitation as a ruthless despot whose reign was unbearable not only for himself, but also for his other subjects. His outrage was so intense that he wept openly as he expressed it. Cortes tried to calm him down and guaranteed his immunity. He also made it clear that the despot's intimidation didn't faze him, as he was confident of his own boundless power, endorsed by divine authority. After a friendly farewell with the gracious Native American, Cortes embarked on his journey to Chiahuitzlan, the designated location for the new settlement. The path led them across fertile lands and inviting forests, and after a reasonable day's venture, they sighted the city perched on a craggy hill. The inhabitants had escaped. Upon reaching the market area, 15 natives came out from a shrine, welcomed the newcomers, reassuring them that their governor and all his people would return immediately, without hesitation, if their safety was secured. Cortes earnestly promised them that nobody would be harmed, and shortly thereafter, the tribal leader and his people overcame their apprehensions and returned. Cortes was delighted to find that the tribal leader from Zempoala was also present. The meeting barely started when there were renewed vehemence about Montezuma's discriminatory practices. Cortes, hearing these grievances for the second time, comforted them and reiterated his pledge of sanctuary. In the meanwhile, some of the Native Americans approached the two chiefs and murmured something that took them by surprise. They jumped up, startled, and vacated the place, shaking. Not sure what had spooked them, they were tracked, and the cause was swiftly found. 6 extravagantly dressed emissaries of Montezuma, escorted by numerous servants, shielding them with feathered umbrellas, paraded by the Spanish compound, casting disdainful looks at Cortes and his officials. Their arrogance infuriated the soldiers to the extent that they had to be held back from physically attacking the Mexicans. Marina, who had been dispatched to gather intel, came back with the update that the emissaries had harshly criticized the chiefs for their duplicitous welcome of foreigners, declared adversaries of their ruler. As punishment for their betrayal, along with the usual tribute, 20 Native Americans were to be handed over to them for sacrifice to appease the offended gods. Cortes was livid but smart enough not to exhibit his anger. He consoled the chiefs that they were safe from any harm and directed them to present Montezuma's representatives to him in chains for explanation. The chiefs, used to their leader's unquestioned authority, were hesitant, but Cortes, allowing them no pause for thought, reiterated his command so forcefully that they didn't dare oppose. The messengers were apprehended, with the Spaniards, for the sake of appearances, staying out of it. Advancing to this stage, the chiefs would have carried on and done to the shackled messengers what Montezuma intended to do to the Native Americans, but Cortes disagreed with such cruelty and ordered that his own men should secure the prisoners. Cortes wanted, if feasible, to mask any apparent aggression towards the influential Montezuma. He slyly devised a plan to impress upon Montezuma that he had nothing to do with what had transpired. He aimed to put Montezuma in a position where he owed him. With this goal, he covertly freed 2 of the captives at night, told them they were no longer prisoners, and asked them to communicate to their leader that he would work to release the rest, and then he dismissed them. The following day, the natives were informed that the captives had somehow fled. Shortly thereafter, the rest of the hostages were allowed to reunite with their companions. This deceptive play came out exactly as Cortes anticipated. In the meantime, other chieftains were discovered in the surrounding hilly areas, who had common disdain for their emperor and were equally eager to escape his oppressive reign. All these indigenous tribe leaders, known generally as Totonacs, made arrangements with Cortes, denied the power of Montezuma, and proclaimed themselves as subjects of the King of Spain. Steps were initiated to establish a city at the newly settled area. The original name, Villarica de la Vera Cruz, was maintained for the city, but today it's simply known as Vera Cruz. Everyone in the Spanish military played a part in building the walls and structures of the city. No one abstained, and Cortes led the way by actively participating. The construction progressed rapidly, and soon The fortified area was well protected against Native American attacks. In the meantime, Montezuma's representatives returned and delivered the optimistic news Cortes was hoping for. Their report significantly eased the king's initial rage, who had previously ordered the assembly of a massive military force to wipe out these foreigners and their Native American allies. However, the king was now quite worried and decided to use gentle tactics to persuade these feared foreigners to leave peacefully, if possible. To achieve this, he sent representatives with high-value gifts, carried by two young princes related to the emperor. They reached the Spanish camp just as the fortifications were being completed. They accomplished their mission, presented the expensive gifts, expressed gratitude to Cortes for his aid in freeing the captives, and ended with a request for Cortes to kindly vacate their ruler's territory. Cortes treated them with utmost respect and responded as such. He was upset that the emperor had been inconvenienced by the detaining of his ambassadors, even though they had essentially brought it on themselves by making an inhumane demand. He hoped this request had been made without the emperor's awareness. Regardless, he affirmed that Christianity does not support the brutal act of human sacrifice, and he felt it his duty to stop it whenever and wherever possible. As for any wrongs done to the emperor, those had been rectified with the release of the detainees. Given his obligations to his allies, he optimistically believed the emperor would forgive the rash actions of the caciques of Zempoala and Chiahuitzlan. He had to shield these subjects of the emperor as they had tried to make up for Teutile's rudeness by offering him a warm welcome. Regarding his leaving the region, he had already conveyed to their leader that a highly significant mission obligated him not to return to his homeland until he had a face-to-face meeting. An European soldier was always ready to undertake any responsibility designated by his superiors. The ambassadors, taken by surprise at the poised and dignified manner in which Cortes addressed them, went back, full of admiration for his bold determination and secret disdain for their own ruler, to whom they communicated everything they had witnessed and heard. The new city in Spain was now successfully defended, and Cortes was fully committed to wrapping up other important matters. Luck appeared to firmly favor him, but his intense religious fervor almost jeopardized everything. A report reached him that human sacrifices were set to occur at one of his allies' temples. Outraged by their brutal superstition, and the fact that such a heinous act could be attempted right under his nose, he dashed to the temple with some of his troops and warned of massive destruction by fire and weapon if they didn't instantly free the intended victims. His fervor didn't end there. He insisted that the priests tear down their idols and abandon their false faith for good, even though they weren't aware of a preferable one yet. The priests collapsed at his feet, crying and grieving, and the tribal chiefs on site were shaking. As they refused to demolish their idols, he directed his troops to do it by force. The priests triggered an armed response, and in no time, Cortes and his small group were encircled by an intimidating crowd. But Cortes stayed steadfast and declared to the gathered crowd that the first arrow thrown by them would bring about the death of their tribal chiefs and total annihilation. The troops proceeded to enforce his orders. Immediately, the idols were thrown to the ground. The sacred vessels and altar followed suit. Everything was destroyed, and the temple was cleansed. The human blood staining the walls was scrubbed off, and the statue of the Virgin took the place of the idols. The stunned Native Americans anticipated divine fire to rain down at any moment and retaliate for this affront to their deities, but not a single spark was noticed. And the temple raiders continued their defiant and victorious task right before their eyes. This weakened their belief and led them to ponder, ultimately driving them to slowly accept that the Spaniards might be godly beings and more powerful than their own gods. They didn't spend much time deliberating, but picked up the remains of their idols and disdainfully tossed them into the fire. The temple was sanctified as a Christian church, and that very day was formally dedicated through Roman Catholic rituals, which greatly intrigued though baffling the Native Americans. Cortes barely evaded the jeopardy his religious zeal put him in when another equally critical situation emerged. Some of the soldiers and sailors, weary of roaming aimlessly and anxious about impending hazards on the journey to the capital, conspired against the commander and resolved to hijack a ship. Their plan was to flee to Cuba and inform the governor about Cortes's actions. Luckily, the conspiracy was uncovered before it was too late. Cortes apprehended the conspirators and applied an appropriate punishment for their transgression. Believing that the dissension was not completely quelled among his troops, he deliberated deeply and finally devised a specific, yet risky, strategy to terrify their cowardly spirits and deter them from contemplating any rebellion. He decided to obliterate their last shred of hope for return and let them choose either to move ahead to the Mexican capital or perish by scuttling his fleet, therefore convincing the faint-hearted ones in his ranks that there was no third option and they must either overcome or succumb. While it was impressive to achieve such a feat, the challenge of getting his army to go along with it was even greater. Luckily, Cortes was as diplomatic as he was brave. He began by disassembling his vessels. He had the sails taken down and everything else on board, as well as the artillery, brought to land. The shipwrights then inspected the vessel bodies and reported they were in such poor condition that it was impossible to fix them. At this point, Cortes was able to motivate his soldiers to such a degree that they eagerly rushed to dismantle the ships, their only fallback should the mission fail, and haul the wood and boards to land. Only one ship was spared to fulfill Cortes's intentions. He had been named leader by the court that he himself had chosen, but in truth, this was not any more official than if he had assigned himself. He was eager to ensure his rights and, with this in mind, he decided to send a ship to Spain to secure the approval of the court for all his actions up to that point, as well as to shake off any further accountability to Velázquez and be declared the sole ruler of the soon-to-be conquered empire. He was aware that there was just one dependable method to achieve his goal, and that was to provide the government with solid evidence of the wealth he could procure. For this evidence to be persuasive, he decided to send all the gifts he had received from Montezuma, and insisted that everyone involved, officers, soldiers, and sailors, should contribute their portion. It was a tough request, but Cortes took the risk and succeeded. Along with these presents, Cortes mailed a letter to the emperor, presenting a comprehensive account of all the events that took place, his various discoveries, his battles and dealings with the locals, their conversion to Christianity, his own perils and hardships, and a plethora of knowledge about the countries he had toured. He explained his issues with the governor of Cuba. What measures were taken with respect to settlements, and implored the emperor to validate all completed tasks as well as his own authority. In the meantime, he was wholly confident that with the aid of his fearless companions, he could bestow the vast Indian empire to the Castilian crown. The officials from Villarica also composed a letter akin to that of Cortes, concluding it with a forceful indictment of the mismanagement of Velázquez, his corruption, extortions, plots for his own financial gain, and neglect of his sovereign's interest. With these two letters, a third was dispatched in the name of Villarica's citizen soldiers, reiterating their loyalty to their ruler and imploring him to reaffirm the selection of Cortes as their leader. The heavily laden vessel, overseen by nobles whom Cortes trusted, departed Villarica de la Vera Cruz on July 26, 1519, and, following precise instructions, anchored briefly on the north coast of Cuba, but luckily evaded the chasers sent by Velázquez. Cortes was now set to embark. His brigade was composed of 500-foot soldiers, 15 horsemen, and 6 artillery units. Among others, around 50, primarily bedridden, and additionally 2 horses, were retained as part of the military base at Vera Cruz. Considering his allies, Cortes had simply 1,300 individuals and 1,000 so-called tamanes, essentially bearers, who had to transport the requisite luggage and food. In that area, Where there weren't any horses or burden-carrying creatures of any type, a specific category of men, referred to as the above, transferred goods from point A to point B. To ensure the safety of those he left in the rear, Cortes snagged 50 of the prominent locals with him, whom he held as captives, albeit they were oblivious to this fact. Chapter 6. Cortes advanced to Tlaxcala, match and downfall of the Tlaxcalans, Montezuma's emissaries. The miniature military force embarked from Zempoala on August 16, 1519. The inaugural day of the journey was uneventful. Their route cut across the land of their allied leader, the chieftain. They were welcomed warmly and treated with exceptional hospitality. At last, they reached the boundary of the Tlaxcala's hilly territory. The local inhabitants displayed a remarkable courage and a deep-rooted desire for liberty, surpassing all other natives of the Americas. They had bravely broken free from Mexican domination, successfully establishing an enduring republic. The nation dispatched its delegates to Tlaxcala, the capital. These delegates, or leaders, when in assembly, served as the legislative body and source of authority for the nation. Their governance also reflected an aristocratic demeanor. Pride, love for freedom, bravery, and martial spirit were the major qualities of this small, yet formidable populace. Montezuma had attempted in vain to subdue them or to incite audacious and domineering spirits among them to seize power. They stood firm against all threats, preserving their cherished freedom, the greatest boon humanity possesses. Cortes was eager to win over such a population as allies, and therefore resolved to initiate a cordial diplomatic outreach, in keeping with local customs, once he reached their territory. 4 prominent individuals from Zempoala were chosen for this mission, and Marina committed to delivering a sophisticated address to the Tlaxcalans, which she memorized. Their attire was as follows. They donned lengthy cloaks made of wool. On their left arm, they held a large shell as a replacement for a shield, and their right hand held a white feathered arrow, its tip oriented downwards, signaling friendship. A red feathered arrow would have signified war. Thus outfitted, they departed fearlessly, certain no harm would befall them. They were mindful, however, to stay on the main road, as only would their attire ensure their protection. The moment the 4 envoys arrived in Tlaxcala, they were ushered into a building specifically equipped with all the essentials for a meeting. The next day, they were summoned by the council, which was in progress, to deliver their message. Due to their age, the gathered members were seated on low seats crafted from unique wood. With the greatest level of respect, demonstrated by draping their heads with their coats, the envoys stepped forward, holding their arrows high, prompting the council members to slightly rise from their seats. They then bowed in their distinct style, and with a calculated pace, advanced to the middle of the room and dropped to their knees, patiently waiting with lowered eyes for the go-ahead to speak. Once this had been given, they sat with legs crossed, and Marina began her speech. Eminent democracy, bold and powerful people, your friends and allies, the chiefs of Zempoala and the mountains, extend their warm wishes for you with plentiful harvests and the defeat of your foes. They further inform you that a remarkable set of individuals have arrived in our nation from the east. They appear more divine than human. They've crossed the ocean in enormous estates, wielding thunder and lightning in their hands as weapons. From what they've told us, they are followers of a greater deity than ours, who absolutely disapproves of oppression and human sacrifice. Their leader carries the message of an extremely powerful king and is obliged by his faith to amend the complaints and torment we've faced from Montezuma. This leader has already liberated us. It's essential now for him to traverse through your territory to Mexico. And he is keen to understand the ways in which this oppressor has mistreated you, so he can protect your rights, as well as his own, and manage other affairs concerning his journey. He comes bearing friendly intentions, asking solely for unimpeded passage through your lands. Rest assured, he pursues only your welfare. His weapons are instruments of justice, and those who wield them innately desire peace. resorting to use their might only against those who initially provoke or assault them. After the speech wrapped up, the messengers knelt, gave a deferential nod, positioned themselves cross-legged, and stood by for a response. The decision-makers at first replied in a casual tone, expressing gratitude for the delivered news. They stated they'd think over Cortes's demand and provide a concrete reply later. With that, they sent the messengers away and began their deliberations. The team opinions varied. Some vouched for peaceful relations, while others pushed for war. The head of the pro-war lot was Xicotencatl, an audacious and hot-headed young man who was only too happy to unsheath his weapon. His group held sway and determined the messengers should be held for various reasons, allowing time for essential war preparations. 8 days elapsed like this, and Cortes, along with his allies, slowly grew doubtful about the reason for the hold-up. It was ultimately settled to push ahead and determine the fate of the messengers and their cause. The Spaniards hadn't travelled far when they ran into a band of armed locals who put up fervent resistance. This prompted a skirmish that ended disastrously for the locals. Meanwhile, the Spaniards, shielded by their protective gear, gathered only a few inconsequential injuries, despite being outnumbered 10-1 by the enemy. After securing this initial win, Cortes didn't let up and pushed further inland. The next day, he was pleased to see 2 of his messengers returning, accompanied by Tlaxcalans. The latter group pointed the finger of blame for the previous day's attack at their allies, the Otomis, who allegedly started the trouble of their own accord, an action which cost them their boldest leader. After this quick explanation, they exited without revealing any definite plan of action. However, their cryptic behavior was soon demystified. The following day, as the Spaniards moved closer to Tlaxcala, the other 2 messengers came back in pitiful condition. They threw themselves at Cortes's feet, crying, clung to his knees, and through dramatic gestures asserted that the deceitful Tlaxcalans had grossly violated international rules and intended to offer them up as sacrifices to their gods. They had managed to escape in the night, but it was clear that these Tlaxcalans aimed at making sacrificial lambs out of the entire Spanish army. Now Cortes knew what he was up against and decided to confront the threat, regardless of how serious it might be. He sprang into action immediately and soon came face to face with innumerable armed Tlaxcalans along with their auxiliaries, commanded by the formidable Xicotencatl. A brutal battle ensued, which at one point came dangerously close to wiping out all of Cortes's forces. A reckless Spanish soldier on horseback charged deep into the dense crowd of enemy soldiers and found himself surrounded. He suffered multiple injuries, and his horse was stabbed multiple times, causing it to fall dead. The natives beheaded the horse, put its head on a spear, and paraded it around for all to see. This was a clear demonstration to everyone that the beast was not immortal, as they had imagined, but had indeed died. This incident filled the Native Americans with an unparalleled bravery, and they battled with such a level of ferocity that their Spanish opponents could no longer resist. Just as their total defeat appeared inescapable, the natives surprisingly silenced their war cries, and the conflict ceased. Horns for withdrawal echoed, and they observed the entire formidable force of the enemy quietly retreating for some unknown reason. The captives later revealed that this retreat was enacted due to the loss of their key warriors, whose positions could not be immediately replaced. In the interim, they considered the horse's head as their top prize. Xicotencatl took it himself and sent it to the council. Cortes then fortified himself in a strategic position and tried again to convince the Tlaxcalans to agree to a peaceful settlement. He sent some of the captives to propose peace terms and cautioned them about the severe outcomes they may encounter should they continue the fight. Xicotencatl was so enraged by his proposals that he brutally mutilated the emissaries and sent them back to the Spanish base to inform the general that he would arrive the following morning with an innumerable army, seize his entire force, and offer it to his gods. The news was disheartening, but it came with something that somewhat softened its harshness. At the same time, Xicotencatl also sent 300 Native American chickens, and a substantial amount of other supplies to ensure the enemy was well prepped before he took them down. The Spaniards laughed at his grandiose posturing and enjoyed the deliveries that renewed their energy for the ensuing day's combat. Xicotencatl kept his promise. He showed up at dawn with a crowd of warriors, and the battle resumed again with remarkable ferocity from both factions. The outcome remained uncertain for a considerable period, but eventually, European expertise outlasted the sheer numbers of the enemy and their fierce bravery. The Tlaxcalans retreated, and the Spaniards claimed the battlefield. Despite their third loss, this battle-ready race wasn't disheartened. Now, they were more convinced than ever that every single European was a sorcerer that couldn't be defeated conventionally. They believed that they had to counter their enemy's magic with the tricks of their own wizards. They turned to charlatan priests who assured them they could predict and perform extraordinary feats far beyond human capacity with their spells. These priests were brought into a meeting and gave the following advice. The Spaniards are the sun's offsprings. During the day, their mother empowers them with her sunlight, making them unbeatable. However, at night, when the sun cannot favor them, their supernatural powers vanish, and they become no stronger than an average being. The superstitious Tlaxcalans didn't question this assertion for a second, and rushed to take advantage of this revelation by launching a night raid. However, Cortes was too vigilant and visionary to be caught off guard by such an opponent. He strategically positioned his guards so that he'd be instantly alerted to their movements to counteract accordingly. To their surprise, when the Tlaxcalans initiated their assault, the Spaniards were already armed and prepared. Despite the Tlaxcalans' fierce battle, they were ultimately repelled with significant losses. These unfortunate people were now utterly bewildered. They were certain the Spaniards possessed supernatural abilities. Otherwise, how could it be that in every conflict they lost thousands, whereas the Spaniards didn't lose a single life? Yet, their most perplexing conundrum was determining the virtue or vice of their own deities. The first realization that dawned upon them was the crucial need to eliminate their deceptive shamans and put an end to human sacrifices. Their following move was to dispatch a formidable delegation to plead for peace. It was constituted of their most prominent individuals, dressed in their ceremonial attire, embellished with white feathers, representing peace. They showed signs of their profound respect from afar, intermittently pausing to touch the ground and then bring their fingers to their lips.